Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Lens. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Over 30 world leaders are set to gather in Malaysia next week for the ASEAN Summit. US President Donald Trump, Chinese Premier Li Qiang, Japan's newly sworn-in Prime Minister Sane Takaichi, and Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva are among the key attendees. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, however, has opted for virtual participation. Experts view Prime Minister Modi's physical absence as a decision to avoid a possible meeting with the US President Trump. This comes after Trump repeatedly claimed that India's plans to slash oil imports from Russia and credited himself for ending the conflict with Pakistan. Meanwhile, External Affairs Minister Subramaniam Jaishankar is expected to hold deliberations with his counterparts at the summit. The three-day event, beginning October 26 in Malaysia, will focus on promoting regional peace and stability through dialogue and economic cooperation. The 10-member grouping remains vital for India, given its Act East policy and its broader vision for the Indo-Pacific region. Joining us right now is Anil Wadhwa, former Secretary East in the Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you very much for joining us. Give us a sense of Donald Trump's message at the ASEAN Summit and what ASEAN leaders will be expecting from Donald Trump by way of assurances.
So, of course, President Donald Trump will be present at the ASEAN Summit, the East Asia Summit, precisely for one day. And he may not attend the main meeting unless it is shifted to the previous day when he is present. Now, there's another reason for that, because the Japanese Prime Minister, who's recently been sworn in, is supposed to host him in Japan from the 27th to the 30th. And in case that happens, then she will have to also leave the meeting for the East Asia Summit to receive him in Japan. And that means that host Malaysia will be looking to see if some adjustments can be made with that meeting. Of course, the ASEAN is grappling with a lot of issues, primarily the fallout from the Trump's tariffs on the ASEAN countries, since a number of them are export-dependent countries. However, at this meeting, it seems that there are no long-term announcements which could come about in terms of development cooperation or otherwise from the Trump administration, especially because the focus seems to be on presiding over the signing ceremony of peace between Cambodia and Thailand, in which President Trump would be presiding. So I have a feeling that the issues at hand, which the ASEAN countries face today, will be, of course, aired, but one does not expect much from by way of a pronouncement coming from the US side as far as these problems are concerned.
Right. Ambassador Wadhwa, about India's presence. Now, this has always been a very important forum for Prime Minister Modi, given his Act East policy. The only time that he did not attend it was 2022. Why do you think Prime Minister Modi is not going this time around in person and participating only virtually?
So I think Prime Minister Modi has conveyed to the Malaysian host that the timing is not right because of the Chhat Puja, which is going on, and the elections in Bihar are on the horizon early next month. He has a number of meetings which are lined up. And of course, earlier he had conveyed to the Malaysian host that he would be attending, but that doesn't seem to be possible now. There is, of course, a speculation, and I think in your report also mentioned that he is perhaps not willing to meet with President Trump. I would not basically accept that kind of argument because, after all, he knew that President Trump was going to be present at the East Asia Summit even earlier when he had agreed to go. So we have, of course, a situation where in recent days, I would say over the last month or so, the negotiations between the United States and India on the BTA have been making progress. The two leaders have been talking to each other. And I think to say that he has avoided going to the East Asia Summit because of what Trump might or might not say to him, I think it's a little far-fetched.
All right. I would also like to ask you about the importance of this grouping uh, at a time of global uncertainty. Do you think Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, when he meets ASEAN leaders and he meets the likes of Donald Trump, they would be seeking some sort of stability in trading relations, in tariffs and security guarantees?
Absolutely. I think the main issue which confronts the countries of ASEAN today are internal. First of all, the civil war in Myanmar, in which the United States will, going forward, play a major role. The Myanmar military junta has announced elections in order that it gains legitimacy, and willy-nilly, if there is no emphasis on inclusivity in these elections, then ASEAN will have to will be forced to accept whatever verdict comes along. So I think some amount of support on inclusivity there would be something that the ASEAN countries would be looking for. The second issue is, of course, the code of conduct in South China Sea. The incidents between China and Philippines, in particular, have increased rapidly over the last few months, and United States remains the other primary power in the region. And so some amount of support from the United States for Philippines and for ASEAN and for maintaining in order in freedom of navigation, etc., would be something that ASEAN again would be looking to be pronounced from the United States side. Now, I must point out here that not all countries of ASEAN will be talking about this, because some of them, of course, do not want to take sides between the United States and China. And some of them are also close to the Chinese view on what is happening in the South China Sea. ASEAN would be divided in pronouncements on this issue. Third, of course, is the intensifying US China confrontation in the region itself. So here again, I think there would be some kind of a reassurance being sought by the ASEAN that conflict will not happen and that confrontation would be reduced. And finally, as you rightly pointed out, is the dramatic shifts in the international trading system, which has been brought about by United States policies, especially tariffs on countries in Southeast Asia, many of whom are export-dependent countries. And some amount of relief going forward would be something that these countries would be looking to. But of course, in the current circumstances, where the United States administration is grappling with a number of countries around the world on the tariffs issue, I do not see any clear pronouncement coming out of the United States in this situation. Now, one more point that I
Right. You
forgot
know,
to add was the question of Gaza, where the Muslim countries, Muslim majority countries in ASEAN, would be looking for some assurance.
right. I'd like to ask you about RCEP. There will be a summit of RCEP nations. Do you feel that India should possibly now start engaging with RCEP, should revisit its position for fostering closer ties with Southeast Asian economies?
So there are two or three related questions here. One is, of course, the review between India and the ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, on which India would be seeking some sort of an assurance on fixed timelines by which it needs to end, because that process has been going on now for some time. On the other hand, India also sees that the IPEF arrangement, which was reached by the Biden administration with countries in the region, of which India was a part of, is now not being pushed any longer by the current Trump administration. So that means that India's integration into the regional economies is a must by whichever means it is possible. And of course, India will try to do that bilaterally by having this review and pushing for digital inclusion and services, etc., going forward. Also making sure that perhaps ASEAN economies invest in the PLI schemes in India. But
Right.
joining the RCEP negotiation, RCEP as such, or CPTPP, that's something which the government will have to take a call on, given the fact that there are a number of negotiations that the country is involved in at the moment.
All right. My final question would be about China. What role would China play at ASEAN at a time when there is a difference between US and China on the issue of trade and tariffs, and the meeting between Trump and the Chinese premier possibly will also set the ground for the Trump-Xi meeting on the sidelines of the APEC summit in South Korea?
You're absolutely right. I think China has traditionally taken the role of a champion of countries who are victims of so-called US policies. And in this case, they would certainly take up the tariffs issue, especially because China itself has been subjected to high tariffs by the current Trump administration. And of course, if there is a preparatory meeting before the meeting with Xi Jinping, then of course there would be some amount of ground which will be covered in this meeting. However, given the short stay that President Trump has at the East Asia Summit, I would not actually feel that this meeting would be necessary, especially if the meeting with Xi Jinping is fixed on the sidelines of the APEC summit.
All right, Ambassador Wadhwa, thank you very much for joining us on the program, giving us your view on what will be the big takeaways from the ASEAN summit and the objectives of some of the leaders present there and what India would go out and achieve there as well. Thanks once again for being with us. We're taking a short break on Global Lens, but don't go anywhere. US has ramped up its pressure on Russia to end the war in Ukraine by imposing sanctions on two of the country's top oil companies. How will it impact China, India, and the rest of the world? We will decode this with Geoffrey Pyatt, former US Assistant Secretary of State and former US Ambassador to Ukraine, on the other side. Welcome back to Global Lens. Washington has turned up the heat on Moscow by imposing sanctions on Russia's two biggest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil. Russian President Vladimir Putin downplayed the impact, saying it won't cause much harm to the country's economy. Trump responded, saying he will see how it works out in 6 months. The European Union joined the United States with more economic sanctions on Russia as it unveiled the 19th package of sanctions this week. In a press release, the U.S. Treasury Department said that the sanctions also apply to all entities in which Rosneft and Lukoil have direct or indirect ownership of over 50% or more. The sanctions could have major implications for China, which is the biggest buyer of Russian oil, followed by India. As per Anil, India imported 1.7 million barrels of Russian oil per day in October. Of this, 1.2 million barrels came from Rosneft and Lukoil alone. This sanction will also affect India's second largest private refinery run by Nayara Energy, which is a subsidiary of Rosneft. Trump's move is a double whammy for India, which is already paying a penalty of 25% tariffs to the US because of its Russian oil purchases. White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt said both India and China have begun scaling back their Russian crude imports. However, analysts believe that a complete ban on Russian imports by Indian refiners remains highly unlikely. Kepler estimates that Russian crude flows to India are expected to stay in the 1.6 to 1.8 million barrels per day range until 21st of November. Direct imports could decline post that, but Russian oil could continue reaching India through intermediaries. Indian refiners may also raise their purchases from the Middle East, Latin America, West Africa and the US, but that could increase the country's crude import bill. Historically, India has avoided oil imports from countries like Iran, Venezuela, when their oil was sanctioned by the US. At the Berlin Global Dialogue, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal responded to the sanctions on Russian oil companies. Goyal said Germany is seeking exemptions from the US sanctions as Rosneft owns 3 refineries in the country. He also asked why India is being singled out. Notably, Rosneft's German business is controlled by German authorities. It was put under Germany's government trusteeship in 2022 after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Its 3 refineries are among the most modern plants in Western Europe and account for 12% of total processing capacity in Germany. We're now joined by Geoffrey Pyatt, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Energy Resources and a former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine as well. Ambassador Pyatt, thank you very much for being with us here on Global Lens. Let me begin by asking you, are these sanctions limited to U.S. entities, or do they mean that any company or government entity anywhere in the world transacting with Rosneft and Lukoil will attract sanctions? And if that happens, what is the penalty there?
So, Parikshit, first of all, great to be with you again. And what I would emphasize is that this represents a significant escalation by the Trump administration. Remember, it's been 8 months, and the Trump administration has declined to take any energy sanctions actions against Russia. But that has now changed. And you see the administration, led by Secretary Bessent, going foursquare against the two Russian energy giants, Rosneft and Lukoil. So the question of secondary sanctions, which you alluded to, is left ambiguous in the Treasury OFAC notice. But this is a clear message to the international marketplace that the Trump administration is not any longer going to tolerate business as usual in the Russian energy sector. I would also make the point that this measure clearly represents President Trump's frustration with President Putin's refusal to accept a diplomatic negotiated solution to the war in Ukraine on the terms that President Trump and his negotiators have been seeking to encourage.
Do you expect, and I'm sure refiners, companies around the world would be seeking clarifications from the U.S. government, but do you expect the White House, the U.S. Energy Department and the U.S. Treasury Department especially to come out with a clarification on whether and under what circumstances would companies transacting with these oil giants in Russia face sanctions?
So we have seen in the past, Parikshit, that generally companies will decline to do business with sanctioned entities in the category that Rosneft and Lukoil now occupy. You see already the signaling, for instance, from Reliance about their intention to reduce their exposure to Russian crude. But the devil is in the details. And as you said, a key question will be enforcement, because there's no doubt that Russia is going to continue to try to sell oil under the table, using its shadow fleet, using cutouts and middlemen. And my expectation is that the big global Indian companies that also do significant business in the United States are not going to want to expose themselves to the risks that come with that kind of transaction. I expect the same also from China's big state-owned enterprises. But we have to wait and see what happens with the smaller companies, and especially what we call the teapots in China, the small refineries that don't have the exposure to the U.S. market that the big companies have. But, and this is crucially important, this is going to drive down the price that Putin is able to get for his crude oil and will reduce the revenues that he is using to pursue his war against Ukraine.
How much success will President Trump achieve with these sanctions? Rosneft and Lukoil account for 50% of Russia's oil exports to the world. Putin is saying that these sanctions will not have much impact. Yes, companies will not buy directly, but analysts here in India expect Russia to remain a part of the global energy mix, and similarly for India and China as well, because many companies buy from intermediaries, they don't buy from Russia directly. So keeping that in mind, how much success can Trump really achieve?
So that depends on enforcement. In the Biden administration, you saw a very rigorous effort led by Treasury, supported by the Department of State in the White House, to follow the trail of these transactions and to go after the cutouts in the shadow fleet vessels. The Trump administration has to decide if they're going to follow a similarly rigorous approach. But it's important that Secretary Bessent said yesterday that these sanctions are not necessarily the end of the road, and that much depends on Putin's behavior going forward. I have a very different perspective from President Putin on the impact of these sanctions. We should have no illusions about the severity of these measures and also about the underlying weakness of the Russian economy, because over the past 4 years of the full-scale invasion, Putin has completely militarized the Russian economy. These oil and gas revenues are what is holding up his economy. And these measures will represent a significant blow, because in any scenario, the price that Russia gets for its oil operating under the table at the margins of global commerce is going to be significantly lower. And that will advance the goal of U.S. policy.
You know, Ambassador Pyatt, I would also like to ask you, and this is a question that India's Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal raised in Berlin some time back. Why single out India? And this is a contradiction, isn't it? You've got the Germans seeking a carve-out for Rosneft. Rosneft has 3 refineries in Germany. At the same time, India is not just being hit with US sanctions on Russian oil entities, but at the same time, there are 25% additional penalty tariffs only on India. So why do you think India is being treated in this manner?
So, Parikshit, the first thing I would emphasize, as I've said publicly on a number of occasions, it is incredibly important that we reach a positive conclusion as fast as possible to the trade negotiations that Minister Goyal is leading along with Ambassador Greer here in the United States, because we have a strong interest on both sides in finding a way forward to strengthen the economic ties that are so important to our strategic relationship. India's oil commerce with Russia has been an obstacle to that in recent weeks, and I'm optimistic that the new signals from companies like Reliance, from Indian Oil, will help to remove that as an irritant and clear the way to a successful conclusion of the U.S.-India bilateral trade negotiations as fast as possible. That will address the tariffs, that will remove a major obstacle to growing the strategic relationship in all of the sectors, like aerospace and high technology, that we began working on nearly 25 years ago in the next steps in strategic partnership. So let me put that aside, and I would differ with Minister Goyal's suggestion that somehow India has been singled out. I would also note, while Germany has asked for an exception in terms of these new sanctions, I've seen no evidence that the Trump administration is looking sympathetically at that request. And I think for India, there is a clear opportunity to diversify its energy flows. It's only in the past 4 years that India came to depend so heavily on Russia as a crude oil supplier. There are obviously tremendous opportunities for Indian companies to do more here in the United States as well, something I've discussed in the past in a very constructive way with Minister Puri and other Indian officials.
Right. Do you expect that if this Russia oil issue is resolved between India and the US, there will be a trade deal? Do you feel this is the only hurdle?
I'm quite optimistic. We were very close before, and I should say, the companies that I work with here at McClarty Associates now see a strong interest in the speedy conclusion of this trade arrangement, because as I've said in the past, you can't have a China plus one strategy in the United States without a strong and growing trade relationship with India. So we should find a way to move ahead quickly with this. I'm encouraged by the positive signals from President Trump in recent days, including following his calls with Prime Minister Modi. And certainly that's in the strategic interests of both countries.
You know, my final question to you, Ambassador Pyatt, how much can the India-US energy partnership expand? As of now, we're told by the government that India's energy purchases, our oil purchases from the US, are already up 60% on a year-on-year basis. They have increased to around 299,000 barrels per day so far. And according to analysts, the upside is just to take it to about 400 to 500,000 barrels per day. And following that, there will be challenges. Possibly you cannot increase imports from US to any further point. And after that, maybe you'll have to focus on LNG imports. What do you think is the upside in terms of expanding the energy partnership?
There's tremendous scope, Parikshit, to expand the partnership, because India has emerged as one of the world's largest energy importers for oil and gas. And the United States today is, in an unrivaled way, the largest crude oil producer in the world. We produce more oil every day, 13.6 million barrels per day, more than the two largest OPEC producers, Saudi Arabia and Iraq together. We are also the world's largest LNG producer. I remember just last summer at Gastech in Dallas, I was able to introduce Minister Puri to Mike Wirth, the CEO of Chevron. I know that there is strong interest from the Indian government in building those kind of partnerships with our largest oil companies, with Chevron, with ExxonMobil, and also, as you note, in the LNG sector, where you are going to see in the next couple of years massive growth in U.S. liquefaction capacity and continued growth in Indian demand. So there is a natural synergy, especially in the LNG sector, for Indian companies to sign long-term offtake agreements with American liquefiers, American producers, and then also to consider investments. Just a few miles from us here in Washington, D.C., the Cove Point LNG facility, you drive up to it, and at the front gate is the logo of Gas India Limited, because Gale was a founding investor there. I would love to see more of that kind of investment by Indian companies on the Gulf Coast, where American gas production is growing so rapidly. So I'm very, very optimistic about this sector, and also the opportunities for continued convergence as American companies seek to reduce their exposure to China, and as Indian companies seek to reduce their exposure to Russia.
All right, Ambassador Pyatt, thank you very much for joining us, explaining us the U.S. strategy comprehensively. With that, we come to the end of another edition of Global Lens. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.